Well, good morning, all. How many of you are out there? So far, well over 20 attendees, and we've got about 40 registered. My name is Elena Falcone. I'm the Director of Public Innovation and Engagement at the Westchester Library System, and I am a happy co-chair of the organization hosting today's event, the Senior Law Day Collaborative. I'm a co-chair with Sarah Steckler of Keenan Bean and Melinda Bellis of Legal Services of Hudson Valley. And we are ably assisted today by Bruce Siegel of Marketing Sense. The collaborative is over 150 professionals who come together from disciplines such as law, finance, geriatric care management, librarians, and others who are concerned and passionate about making sure that you're all informed about topics related to elder law, elder care, living well as we age. You probably know about all of this because you've been savvy and gone to, let me share, our website, the Senior Law Day Collaborative site, which is seniorlawday.info. For many of you, that is how you got to register for today's program. And I just want to call out that this site is kind of our focal point for a lot of our activity, particularly during this pandemic universe time. On the site, you can find out about upcoming webinars. You can importantly connect to the videos, the recordings of prior webinars. So the part one of this series took place right in December. So you can just click on this title and you get right to the video of Robert giving the last presentation. All the ones that we do, as soon as we can, we post them up here under 2021 webinars. So we've tried to make this as simple as possible. This site also has resources for you that include not just the webinars, but our elder law Q&A. A complete volume that is an unbiased and authoritative reference on all of these topics in elder law: wills, taxes, Medicare, powers of attorney, the future care planning, elder abuse. All of those topics are covered there. Additionally, that product is available in Spanish, and that's particularly important in our county. And if you have a question that occurs after today, anytime during the year, you just click this Ask Us button. And usually there's someone here who can do live chat to try to respond, but generally we will take your question by email and we'll get it to the right person who can give you a response. So anything that is fairly specific, we can do. But then the other alternative is to look out for one of our key events, which is about once a quarter now, we're having a morning on Zoom of consultation opportunities. So you get the chance to speak with any of our professionals about your particular issue. So please stay in touch with us. There's a way to sign on to our mailing list, and we really want to make sure that you have the opportunity to be well informed, which is why we have part two today with Robert Kestenbaum, the monument specialist. Oops, almost minutes. The monument specialist with Dignity Monuments. I hope you got to listen to part one because he really explained a number of things like the value of pre-planning, the services of a funeral home, a cemetery, memorialization. It was and the role of lawyers in all of this. It was really quite informative. And my key takeaway, Robert, from viewing that webinar was also being very relieved that New York State has such strong consumer protection around this. I know it's different in other states, and I appreciate that you addressed that. Today, Robert is going to be covering monument. Actually, he's going to give us a lovely summary of what he covered last week. Last December. But also then jump into briefly talking more about monuments, because there are questions there. Steps to take when someone dies. So this is kind of like a bit of a summary of sort of what happens next. And the topic that's near and dear to my heart, communication tips, how to enter into those important conversations with your children, with your parents, with your friends and others. So that is his plan. I'm going to work as a moderator to keep him going, and I'm going to be looking for your questions. You'll note that there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on an iPad, you have to tap to find some of the options. Please go right ahead and send your questions in. I'm going to work hard to make sure that we can slot them in, and I'll probably be rude occasionally and break in to pause Robert so we can make sure we get some of those answered. If we don't catch something, don't worry. So long as you've given us your email address and you haven't asked anonymously, we are diligent about following up. So with that, And yes, the seniorlawday.info is the website URL, and I'm hoping that that question is now well addressed. Robert, would you please jump in and inform us?
Thank you. Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Hopefully by the end of today's session, you'll know if the reason we ran out of time last time was because I speak too slowly, or if because there's just a whole lot to cover in this topic. I know what I think is the answer, but you get to decide for yourselves. As was mentioned, this is the second part of a two-part webinar. The first one was in mid-December. Many of you likely were not online for that. And so, as was mentioned, I'll present a brief outline. Don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz. And if you missed anything, when we get to the questions and answers, it doesn't matter if it's covered today or was covered before or it wasn't covered at all. We'll answer questions about anything. My particular story is many, many decades now of involvement in this field. I spent several years with one of the largest burial societies in New York. The last 10 years, I was director of family services at the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And then recently I was asked to launch a new monument program with Dignity Monuments, which is really the only full service monument program in Manhattan, but it covers the entire New York metropolitan area. So as was mentioned also, the first session focused on fundamentals of pre-planning, and we'll do a quick overview of that. It's really the value and importance of pre-planning for those who are interested in knowing what the importance is and why one should consider doing it. And there are a few very specific things that result from pre-planning. Or putting it another way, in terms of the consumer's perspective, we hear basically three reasons why people pre-plan. The first is simply to shield their loved ones from having to make what are very emotional decisions if pre-planning wasn't done. And I can honestly say that never, and I hardly ever use the word never, but in this case, I have never heard a complaint from a family member of a loved one who has passed, who had pre-planned things, saying that they felt that they were cheated out of the opportunity to make all these terrible decisions. And that's only partially tongue-in-cheek, but it's accurate. It is something that people express very clearly. They don't want their children, spouse, whomever, to have to go through that process. Secondly is financial reasons. It's not surprising to know that if people have to make decisions under stress or uninformed, or under stress and uninformed, they may tend to overspend. They may purchase a service that is not needed or that their loved one didn't want. And there are lots of expenses involved. And so incurring extra expenses just frankly makes no sense. The other part of the financial discussion is that costs go up over time, and sometimes significantly over time. When one pre-plans, it locks in whatever the cost is today, whatever that day is. And that can be cemetery property. It can be the services of a funeral home. And it can be a monument. All of these things can be not only pre-planned, but pre-purchased. And if they're guaranteed, which is what you would be looking for, then future increases in costs will not affect the ultimate cost for the people who ultimately make the arrangements. And then the third is it's the only clear way to express one's wishes. There have been several times when I have sat in what's called the arrangement room, which is when the arrangements are being made for burial, for example, when I ask a question about what the family wants, and there might be 3 or 4 adult children there, and they look at each other and they don't know what to say. They don't know the answer. They'll look at each other and say, do you know what mom wanted? Do you know what uncle so-and-so wanted? Do you? And they don't know. So when one expresses their wishes, it's really a gift to others, because that just adds to the stress, and not just the stress at the moment. It can be stress after the fact when people wonder for quite a period of time if they did the right thing. And in that regard, one of the things I tell people is there are no wrong answers when they're pre-planning. If what they want is legal, and if it's doable, and it's important to them, that's the right answer. There are no wrong answers. The answer to what should I do is, here's what you can do, and let's have a conversation about what it is you would like within that context. We also covered the roles of various entities that are involved in the process, what the funeral home does, what the cemetery does, and what a legal advisor does. Obviously, they do different things. One of the things people are sometimes surprised to know is that, as was, I think, mentioned before, in New York State, the services of a cemetery and those of a funeral home are separate by law. And that's part of the consumer protection laws in New York. In other states, under one roof, so to speak, you can have the funeral home, the cemetery, the florist, the caterer, the monument, everything in one place. And one can argue which is the best structure, but this is the one we have in New York. Regardless of the specific arrangements that are done, whether it involves a monument, the funeral home, or property in a cemetery, everything has to be in writing by law. But you have a role to play in making sure that's the case. So you're going to insist on a formal document, because this is a formal transaction that is highly regulated in New York. And in fact, there's some federal laws involved as well, the Federal Trade Commission, relating to the services of funeral homes in particular. But you're not going to accept something that's scratched on the back of an envelope. You're not going to accept something that does not lay out your rights with regard to where the money is going, or cancellation privileges, or any detail about what is included. If you are meeting with somebody and they tell you something is included, but it is not in the document, it's not included, at least not officially. So you need that assurance. And that's not to suggest that anybody is going to cheat you. It's just that when both entities have the same information, then 100 years from now, hopefully, when that document becomes important and the people who executed the document are perhaps no longer available, it is a clear expression of the plans that were made and what is to be done, and in particular, of course, what is included in that contract. So that's basically what we covered last time. And I think actually, even though we're not up to questions and answers, there was a question that was sent that I think fits well into this portion of the discussion. And so, with your permission, I'm going to answer that one now. Question had to do with how do you, when you're doing a pre-plan with a funeral home, how do you make sure that the grave opening at the time of need is covered, and how to assure that that entitlement is something that does come to fruition. Now, there are several aspects to that. First of all, it has nothing to do with the pre-plan, except if the funeral home includes, and many do, many will, many won't, but excuse me, if they include it in the pre-plan. So what the funeral home would do at that time is contact the cemetery, find out what their current costs are for that particular service, and then add that, include that in the menu of items that have been selected with today's cost, again, whatever that is. And with a guaranteed pre-plan, whenever that service is used, the assumption is the earnings, whatever those are these days, on the fund will have sufficient amount to cover what that cost is in the future. But the funeral home in those instances will cover it. Now, on the cemetery end of things, one could ask that question regardless of whether there's a pre-plan or not. If there is, whether it's a single grave for one person or a family lot or plot, different cemeteries, by the way, use different terminology. If it's a family area and one of the graves is to be used for the individual in question, that individual can do several things to assure that they will be able to be interred in that space. If they are the owner of the property, the owner always has the right of burial. And in effect, anybody, including the funeral director at the time, although that's somewhat rare, anybody can sign authorizing the individual to be interred there. There's also, if there's any question, in New York State, there's something called an agent form. And basically, that's simply the person who is planning for themselves designates something called an agent, and it's an agent to control disposition of remains. That person has no responsibility in terms of the finances. All they are doing is agreeing to sign at the time the paper that allows for the individual, for the decedent, to be interred in their space. Again, they have no authority beyond that and no responsibility beyond that. But it gives the person doing the plan peace of mind about somebody has the authority to take care of this. And by the way, that is whether somebody has a pre-plan or not. Anybody can do that. And different pieces can be pre-planned. One can purchase cemetery property and not do a pre-plan with a funeral home. Vice versa, one can do a pre-plan with a funeral home and not secure cemetery property, although most likely a funeral director will ask when they're doing a pre-plan if the individual has secured a final resting place. But again, it's up to the individual. In addition to an owner and the right of burial, most cemeteries will have something, they call it different things, but it's in effect a designation. So again, whether it's one grave or it's 10 graves and the individual is going to be in one of those graves, the cemetery will permit, through usually an affidavit, the designation of a particular space for a specific person. And that document, the affidavit, would be filed with the cemetery so that at the time the person passes, the agent or a loved one or just about anybody else would be able to sign the interment authorization to allow the individual to be buried in that space. The affidavit would be executed by the owner of the property or owners of the property. And I would caution that in various areas, there are some cemeteries that are very, very old. And therefore, we're dealing with multiple generations. And if the people who purchased the property originally are no longer around, then in addition to a designation affidavit, there would be an heirship affidavit, which establishes the current people who are authorized to control what happens in that space. So I think that addresses all of the possibilities that relate to that specific question.
I think that question allowed you to cover a lot of the review issues that we had as well.
Indeed.
Can you also, related to that, there was a question that has come in on the Q&A about discussing that sort of having similar issues related to cremation, where the ashes can be placed and things like ecological cremation sites. Before you get to monuments, would this make be a good time to address that?
Sure. So briefly, I would tell you that cremation is the fastest growing option that the public is going in that direction these days. And as such, cemeteries have greatly increased the options with regard to final resting place. Still, though, many people, in fact, probably statistics show most people take the cremated remains home with them, which is something when I was in the cemetery setting, I cautioned people that although that's fine, if that's what you would like to do now, it is helpful to think about what happens several years down the road, because you don't want the cremated remains ending up on a shelf in a closet someplace, or worse. And this happened several times. The cemetery would get a phone call from somebody saying they just bought a home, they moved in, they looked in a closet, and there was a black plastic box, and they want, with the cemetery's name on it, they want to know what it was. And it was a box of cremated remains that the people forgot to take. I don't believe that the person who brought those cremated remains home with them originally intended for that to be the case in terms of where they ended up. So with regard to final disposition of cremated remains, if there is a final resting place that is desired, the options are really quite broad. There are people who will inter the remains in a grave, either full grave or a cremation grave. There are such things, graves that are smaller. And the reason they do that is, well, there could be several reasons. One is that's what their family has always done. It could be related to what kind of monumentation they want. Many people want a standard or traditional monument of some type, and the only way to do that is to have a burial site. Similarly, the cremated remains can go in a crypt in a mausoleum, which is usually for full casket. More likely, if it's in a mausoleum, it would go in something called a niche. And a niche is simply a smaller space that has a tablet on the front. And on the tablet is where the inscription goes, the memorialization. The name, years of birth and passing, possibly dates, possibly other kinds of things. It depends on the rules and regulations of the cemetery. There are many laws, health department laws, about cremated remains being buried in parks or scattered they are technically against the law. One could go out to sea. There is a particular distance that one would have to go before it's not illegal to scatter the cremated remains at sea. And a funeral home would be able to advise the family as to what that is and a service that can be provided to do that. In terms of the newest kind of things, there are various settings now available in cemeteries increasingly that are perhaps more ecologically sound. There are, in particular, there's one called an ossuary. An ossuary comes from a Latin word having to do with what the cremated remains actually are, and that is simply an underground receptacle that has no environmental impact. The cremated remains are commingled with others, and then there is likely a wall of some type, a memorial wall, where individuals could purchase a plaque, a bronze plaque, most likely, that has memorialization of the individual whose cremated remains have been scattered in this underground receptacle.
Robert?
And normally that would be at a location that is more bucolic in feel. It might be next to a lake or alongside a stream or something like that.
So I think you've given us again, the cremation question also allowed you to sort of wrap up a whole number of issues. So it's the funeral home directly, the funeral director, that could help you to understand your options regarding cremation.
Yes.
Okay, that's what. Yes. So where do you go? Where do you go for more? I'm going to ask you to jump on to the next content so that so that we have enough time.
Okay. So last time where we took our break was in the discussion of monuments. Monuments is what I call the forever part. Most monuments are made of granite. Granite is forever. Well, good granite is forever, which I'll just tell you very briefly is one of the things you have to look for. If you're purchasing a monument, find out where it's coming from. If it's coming from, for example, most people purchase something called Barry Gray, which is a gray granite. It comes from Vermont, and it's excellent. There are also granites that come from other places. In particular, the market has been flooded with granite from China, and that granite does not hold up as well, or doesn't hold up, in fact. Over time, it's actually somewhat porous, which is an anomaly when you're talking about granite. So you do want to know where the granite is sourced. A few things to keep in mind. If the type of monument is important to you, then you shouldn't back into the decision in terms of a particular cemetery or a location in the cemetery. And by that, I mean all cemeteries have rules and regulations regarding monumentation. And if you're interested in a traditional upright monument, but the area of the cemetery only permits flat markers, that's going to be disappointing at some point. All cemeteries will tell you what kind of monuments are permitted in what area. So that's something that you can be proactive about in getting that information so as to be able to get what you'd like in the future. I've had many instances where people want to put a particular type of monument someplace, and when checking with the cemetery, the answer comes back, that's not what's permitted there. Similarly, one might be a member of a group of some type, a religious institution or a membership organization of some type, a burial society perhaps. They may have their own regulations in terms of what type of monuments. In fact, they likely do, because uniformity is something that is often a goal. So there too, you will want to ask that question.
Ask the question of whom? Of the funeral director who will ask the cemetery, or are you doing that directly to the cemetery?
If you are a member of a burial society or some other group, you would ask it of that, yes. But the real advocate or liaison in that regard is the monument dealer, because they will be dealing with the cemetery in order to prepare the paperwork the cemetery requires before a monument can be placed. Normally, a monument will be on a base of some type, a foundation rather, and it's the cemetery that pours the concrete for that foundation, and they don't do it without a fee, an application form, and all kinds of paperwork that assures them, the individual who's authorized to do so, has approved this this item. Before we leave monuments, there was a question that came this morning, I believe, about the role of the funeral home and monuments. It depends on the funeral home, but many funeral homes do have a monument program. I would say increasingly, funeral homes have a monument program. And they don't do the manufacturing themselves. They will make arrangements with a manufacturer, but they will take the order and they will take the payment, and then they will pay the cemetery, they'll pay the manufacturer, but they will shepherd the manufacturing of the monument through the process. In New York State, if a funeral home sells a monument, it must be on a separate contract. It can't be a line item on the funeral contract. And those of you who have had the unfortunate occasion to make arrangements for somebody who has passed, you know that this is quite a list of items that that are listed in terms of the services the funeral home is providing, because the law says they must be itemized. Law also says they must provide that information in advance on request. So again, consumer protection.
Robert, I just want to pause to now I know why all the consumer protection laws are there. I mean, but there's 4 different vendors that then someone who is grieving has to contend with.
Yes.
Funeral home director, monument, crematorium, potentially cemetery, at least 4. Wow.
Now,
so what are the steps to take? I mean, this is really, how do you navigate us through this?
Well, most crematories in New York are part of a cemetery. So that can be something that is coordinated. Similarly, many monuments, as we just discussed, many monument resources are directly with the funeral home. So these things overlap. The different areas can't do their work without the others, but they're mostly parallel. And what does overlap is communication and paperwork and assuring various kinds of things. So there's a lot that happens behind the scenes when we're meeting with whomever in this list of professionals. There's a lot that happens behind the scenes in terms of making arrangements and making sure that the arrangements are clear. Putting it simply, making sure the right person ends up in the right space, that the correct person who is cremated ends up in the urn that somebody takes home with them. And there are steps in place to assure those things. But that's all back of the house, inside baseball, as the expression goes, that happens out of the view of the public, but does happen.
Terrific.
Sometimes
Thank you.
because
Thank
it
you
has
for clarifying.
to.
I do want us to get to the steps to take and the communications issues.
Okay. So there are many people who don't pre-plan. I think more people don't than do. And so it's important to know what to do if somebody passes. Now, in some instances, the answer is very easy. If somebody is a member of a burial society or a synagogue, for example, that has burial grounds, in a cemetery or a church or any entity that owns directly burial space, usually what one should do first, or it's either 1 or 1A, is call that entity. And there will be somebody there who will guide them through everything that needs to be done next. Now, in some cases, if somebody is a member of a burial society, or sometimes they're called an association, in most of those, by the way, are something called Landsmannschaften, which is a Yiddish term for groups that came from Eastern Europe. And one of the first things people did in the great immigration years was secure a burial place, and found that they could do that more economically if they did it together. So people who came from the same town, for example, would get together, they'd buy a particular area in a cemetery, and then on and on through the years. So if somebody is a member of one of those entities, phone call would go to that entity. Even before that, though, if the person who passes is in a facility of some type, a hospice, hospital, skilled nursing, assisted living, at-home hospice, the entity that is providing the service is skilled in knowing what to do. And the staff of that facility will be able to advise the family what they should do. Now, regardless of those two possibilities, where there is either membership someplace or the person is in a facility, a funeral director is going to be either call 1 or call 1A. Because a funeral director will take care of literally every aspect of the person's journey from the place and time where they pass to what's called the final disposition. And once the funeral director, the funeral home, takes possession of the deceased, they are responsible for everything until care of the deceased is transferred to another entity. And there are really only two entities they can be transferred to. One is a cremation facility. The other is a final resting place in a cemetery. That funeral home and the funeral director representing that funeral home cannot leave the cemetery, should not leave the cemetery, some do, until that transfer takes place, until the casket is lowered, until the crematory staff accepts responsibility and possession of the deceased, things of that nature. So one would call a funeral home. Hopefully one knows who to call. Often people choose a funeral home because that's where their family always went. Clergy has recommended somebody. They're in the neighborhood. Any number of reasons. And all of those, I think, would be the most common. The funeral director, and remember the word director in their title is really very descriptive. There's nothing that happens, as I mentioned before, nothing that happens without them making it happen from this point to the final disposition. The funeral home, if, by the way, if there is a pre-plan in effect, one should call that funeral home who made the pre-plan. Often the pre-plan is portable. So if somebody doesn't want to go to that funeral home that made the pre-plan, the fund can be moved to another funeral home, but it's no longer guaranteed. Again, there are consequences of every decision, but certainly the cleanest, simplest, least costly, most economical way to go is if there's a pre-plan in place, that's where one would go, and the funeral home would know that. The funeral home is going to want to know if there was a pre-plan in effect. They're going to want to know if the person was a member or retired member of the military, because there are benefits that accrue for members of the military, all the way up to things like the monument or the burial place in a military cemetery. The funeral director will also ask about this issue of membership in an entity. And the reason for that also is for the funeral director to ascertain if the person has the right of burial someplace. And the funeral director will dig through that process and get to the bottom of an entitlement, if indeed an entitlement exists. They are the detective, and they'll ask some questions, and sometimes the family doesn't know. And when we talk about communications, that's going to be one of the things that we talk about. A little farther down, those were the immediate kinds of things. A little farther down, but not that far, one should notify the physician of the deceased. And there are many reasons to do that. One very simply is that the physician would want to know. Another reason could be that there are important considerations. Somebody might have a pacemaker. Somebody might have an artificial joint. Somebody might have been undergoing radiation therapy or chemotherapy, things that the funeral director will want to know. If there's exposure to radiation, you can understand that somebody would want to know that. Of course, it's obvious, close family and friends should be advised. Also, if there are any dependents, or the one that a lot of people forget, pets in the residence of the individual, particularly if they lived alone, these things have to be addressed. And dependents and pets need to be cared for, and the residence needs to be maintained. So these are the kinds of things, maybe not that morning, but soon, that need to be addressed. Later on, consulting with an attorney in terms of accessing various papers or funds or whatever the case might be, issues of the residence. It can be complicated, it can be simple, but most people need help navigating what happens next. Social Security needs to be advised. If the person was on Social Security. The Veterans Affairs Department, if the person was a veteran, should be advised, again, because there can be some benefits that accrue. One of the things people forget about is a pension plan. Often there's still funds in a pension plan or other kinds of benefits that are connected to a pension plan. So one would contact the pension plan. Also, if the person was working, the employer should be contacted, not only because you need to tell them that the individual has passed, but there could be a life insurance policy that was in place through employment, a group life insurance policy, or other kinds of benefits. There could be a death benefit of some type or some other kind of insurance that was in place. Some employers provide accident insurance of some type. And if the person passed as a result of an accident, that insurance may be in place. So there are reasons to contact one's employer if the person is still working. Sometimes even a retiree may have benefits through that retirement situation, often through a collective bargaining agreement. If they were a member of a union, there might be something in place in that regard as well. So there are lots of people to speak with, but the important thing to remember is that you're not alone. The issue of what do I do now, there are lots of folks out there who can help. And the funeral director is really key in helping you through the process.
So it sounds like so much of this is predicated or is eased by having done some pre-planning, as you said, and it really ties to, I think, your last point about communication. I'm thinking of, my husband and I both know where things are and that, but so typically, how many of the families that you work with have had the conversation about what their wishes are and some planning around what to do?
So I'm not going to give you a percentage because it's not two choices. Most people have had some type of conversation. I almost said very few. I'm going to take that back. I wish more would have the entire conversation. Not as many have the entire conversation as have had some conversation. Sometimes people share everything. Sometimes people share nothing. Most people share something. Sometimes it's a little something. Sometimes it's a lot of something. It depends. So I think that is a good place to get to the communications, because after all, the title of the webinar is "I don't want to talk about it," and turns out, and this works a little easier when we're in person, and hopefully someday we will be again, someday soon. But it turns out that people do want to talk about it, particularly once we get going. So the key in communications is to tell somebody. If you make a plan in life, regardless of what it's about, if you make a plan and you don't tell anybody what that plan is, and they have no way of accessing the information, you didn't make a plan. It's that simple. You didn't make a plan. I can't tell you how many times I had received a phone call at the cemetery from somebody a year after their loved one passed, and they didn't know that they had purchased a grave at that cemetery, and they were buried elsewhere. And then they found a deed, a certificate of ownership. And instead, they ended up paying $10,000 at another cemetery for a new grave, and they didn't have to. And of course, they ended up overspending. But worse, they didn't fulfill the wishes of their loved one because the loved one didn't tell them. So, tell somebody is the mantra. How one does that, of course, becomes the artistic portion of this process. The famous story I tell, which is very helpful, and I've had this happen, is what I call the Thanksgiving story. The parents, the mom, whoever it is, decides the family is together on Thanksgiving. I'm going to use Thanksgiving as the opportunity to tell everybody what I want. And I have had occasions where people have told me that, and I have begged them not to do it. And the reason is because invariably what happens is mom brings out the beautiful apple pie and the pumpkin pie and whatever else is for dessert, and says, kids, I want to tell you about my plans for when I'm no longer here. And one of the kids invariably says, Mom, why did you have to go and ruin an otherwise perfect Thanksgiving by bringing up this topic? The problem there is that the communication doesn't happen, and it's going to take longer to get back on track to be able to talk to them. Now, the way to solve the challenge of getting people to listen or getting people to talk about it is they're different techniques. One of the tools that can be used is most funeral homes have what's called and many cemeteries do as well, have what's called a planning guide. And it's a booklet where you write down everything that's important, everything you want, where important papers are, the kinds of things that you would tell somebody in terms of this tell somebody mantra. And you get the people together or an individual, and you say the following. I understand you don't want to talk about it. I got news for you. I don't want to talk about it either. So here's what we're going to do. You see that table over there? Make believe there's a table over there. In my case, there actually is. The top left-hand drawer of that table has something in it that will tell you everything you need to know should something happen to me. And two very interesting things happen as soon as one does that. The first thing is you fulfill the imperative of telling somebody. Easy. They now know what to do when the time comes. But the other thing, this one's really fascinating. The other thing is once people know there's something in that drawer, some information, something interesting, something to argue about, something to talk about, they are so much more likely to engage in the conversation. Some people may think selfishly, oh, gee, I guess what's in there is who gets the jewelry, or something of that nature. Or it can be exactly what we're looking for, specific interest in what do I do if. So that technique, it's not like you're fooling anybody, but you're using a tool to bring them to where you are. There are other tools. Sometimes it's very helpful for the person to sit down and write a letter to themselves, what they would say if they were on the other end of the conversation. That helps them be more complete in the information that they're going to be passing along. Practicing the conversation with a friend before talking to loved ones can be helpful as well. It's important to remember, and all of you know the people with whom you're going to be sharing this information a lot better than I do. I don't know them at all, in fact. So you're going to have to judge the best way to have that conversation. There's some people who do very well over the phone. There are other people who are going to want to be at the dining room table with a cup of coffee. Some people, a park bench is the best place, a coffee shop, wherever, the gym. If it's a setting that's comfortable, you will know that once you think about it. And you do have to think about it. But remember, it's probably going to take more than one conversation. And you may go backwards sometimes. So be patient, because this is something that you've been thinking about, and the person you're talking to, it's new to them. They need the space and time to accommodate the information that you're giving to them. But there's a way you can introduce it as well. Some people come right out and say, I need to tell you something. Well, don't say that. Say, I need your help with something. What is this help that you need? Well, I was thinking about Mr. So-and-so who lives down the street, who recently passed away. And I got to thinking, I'm okay now, but what's going to happen whenever? And I need your help in that regard. So that tempers it somewhat. And again, people would be more apt to have the conversation. And you're going to need to sort of identify when they're ready to hear specifics. So it's not a lecture, and you're not throwing information at them. It is a dialogue. But again, be patient, people, accommodate information at various rates. I attended a seminar once where a person was very, very intent on everybody coming away with at least one concept, and that was the relationship between the word listen and the word silent. Mix up the letters, it's the same word. But it's a good thing to remember in terms of how you're going to get information where you want it to be.
That's a great point.
I love teaching. And basically, I have all this information, and if I don't do something with it, I think my head's going to explode. So these techniques are very important to be able to share. And basically there can be some other things, but those basic communication techniques can really do the trick.
You've really covered everything you promised. And I have to say, this is between part 1 and part 2. We've actually covered I think the whole gamut of experience. There are, of course, other questions. There are 1 or 2 that are fairly specific that I'm going to ask you to respond to afterwards.
Sure.
But just because of timing, I want to, Robert, thank you so much. I've got a bunch of notes, and I really am moved by your comments on communication. It's, that people absorb all of this at different rates. We're at different places and levels of readiness to have a conversation about our own mortality and how we'd like to be remembered. So I think you're encouraging us not to walk away from that, because the opportunity is to offer some ease to our family afterwards. I want to again show the screen for the Senior Law Day website, if you would. So our webinar is going to be posted on the homepage of the site. It'll be right there under our most recent webinar, which I will replace the lovely one that was on the new power of attorney form. Just give me 24 hours and this will all be tidied up and posted. The prior webinar, part 1, was delivered in December of 2020. So that is right there. And if you click, you'll see that you're just launching the YouTube application. I'm going to go back to the screen, and I want to also take an opportunity to say that on the seniorlawday.info site, you have a link to some resources that are valuable right now, information on vaccine registration and on COVID-19 and the various vaccines. This is maintained by the Westchester Library System. And the thing I really want to draw your attention to is near Project Hope. Project Hope is a crisis counseling and referral service. There are counselors ready to talk to you. We will, if you leave your name and number, you'll get a call right back. And we're here just to listen to the challenges that you might be facing during this pandemic and to direct you to resources that could actually help. And with that, I'm going to turn this over after saying again, thank you to Robert for 2 powerful webinars. I really appreciate it. We all do. And let me turn it over to Bruce, who's going to tell us what next.
Well, thank you, Elena and Robert. I just wanted to, 2 more things. I just wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsors of these programs, they've been really terrific, as these are the 2020 sponsors. They helped us move when we were doing all of our programs in person, as Robert alluded to move immediately to virtual and provide these services. So thank you, everyone. We do have a number of commitments for 2021 sponsors, and we will have that list to show next time, the next webinar that we have. And then